50 years ago, Edwin Starr asked the question, war, what is it good for? He answered nothing. Unfortunately, he's probably wrong, and that's what we're here to talk about. What is a war? What is a just war? We can look at the definition of war. Clausewitz suggests that war is simply the logical extension of a political program that has not succeeded via more peaceful means. We would like to have a better trade relationship with you. You don't want to negotiate a deal, we'll invade you, and then you'll have to be because you'll be part of us. We want more land for our people. You're not willing to give us any? Well, we'll just come and take some. A violent extension of the political will of a nation. Clausewitz. St. Thomas provides us with a definition of a just war, and from that notion of just war, we can extrapolate to exactly what is meant by a war. Why does just war matter? Well, wars were a fact of life throughout the Middle Ages and right on in through the Renaissance and right up till today. If Clausewitz is right, there's no way around it. Ultimately, not every negotiation will succeed, and yet the political will to move forward will stay alive. Indeed, war is espoused in the Bible. God commands wars. So the question has to be settled, which wars are okay wars and which wars are not okay wars to be carrying out. So, St. Thomas suggests that a just war has to meet 3 qualifications. Qualification 1, it must be carried out by a sovereign power. What do we mean? Well, in St. Thomas's time, that was an easy question to settle. It had to be carried out by a leader of a nation, a political unit. Dukes could carry out wars, kings could carry out wars. The neighborhood couldn't have a war. One gang fighting another gang, not a war. Only sovereign rulers, people who have the power to make the decision for what a group of people do, have the right to make a war. Or not so much have the right to make a war, I suppose, is have the power to make a war. Someone else does it, it's not war. It requires a motive for the war, a starting point, a first cause, if you will. To use language Aquinas would have been perfectly happy to hear. That cause will lead to the war, but the war must also be fought with an outcome in mind. It isn't mindless violence. It isn't just, we're going to go over and tear up their neighborhood for a while. There's an outcome that is sought, a goal that it must achieve if we're going to call it a war. Now, a just war requires the sovereign, requires that the sovereign be just, it requires a cause, and requires that the cause be an appropriate one to launch a war. And the outcome sought must be one which is a just outcome. The sort of thing we have in mind here is you don't go to war over an insult to your underwear. You don't seek as the outcome of a war the complete obliteration of the enemy. Neither of these are just outcomes. Neither of these are morally defensible reasons for going to war, nor outcomes to having a war. So Aquinas gives us some very definite notion of what a war is and what a definite notion of a just war is. A big part of the opening of the Declaration of Independence is spent upon making it clear that that war, the American Revolution, is a just war. The reasons given indicate, one, that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one nation, if you don't know the rest, look it up. I don't have time to look it up again. But I know that what it's talking about is the severing of the relationship between the United States, well, what will be the United States of America, and the British government. So they have to establish first that they are entitled to be a sovereign power. The wrongs done to them give them the right to be separate from the Crown of England. Then once that's established, they can say, here is just cause for a war. So it's not enough simply that we did all we could do. We argued all we could argue. They had nothing to do with this. They put all these unfair penalties on us, treated us poorly. So we just said, the heck with you guys, we're out of town. Now we're independent and should be independent. We're entitled to be independent. So now in order to get the things we got coming to us, we have to launch a war. We have to get them to understand we're us, you're you. And that's the goal stated. It's not we want redress for wrongs. It's not we're going to invade them next. It's simply we've been wronged bad enough. We're entitled to break away. If we're entitled to break away, then we're the sovereign power. We're entitled to that. Our rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These have been violated, so we're entitled to push away from England. Once entitled, then we explain our complaints, how we've been treated wrong, and in order to get these people who have treated us wrong to go away, we're entitled to go to war. The outcome of the war is a fair and meaningful, just outcome. We just want our independence. Go away, leave us alone. That's all we ask. We're entitled to ask. You've given us reason to ask, so do it. So just war is a concept that carries right through to the present. When we take a look then at pacifism, we might be just a little mystified. If war is the logical extension into the physical world of ideas and concepts that we tried to negotiate on paper and between peoples and couldn't manage, if it can be carried out in a manner that can be called just, why then do we reject war? Bertrand Russell rejects war simply because he thinks it's too easy to resort to. Easier to go to war than to keep pushing through a conversation. Easier to go to war than to succeed in a negotiation. War is the easy way out, the simple way out. We should find a way to keep the peace. Of course, there's arguments about the innocent dying. There's arguments about the destruction of everything around. But the peace is the natural state of affairs, says Russell. The peace is what we all seek all the time. Nobody says, oh, let's have more wars. Everyone says, let there be peace. If that's what we want, then we should hang on to it for all it's worth. Now, Russell proposes that there are two approaches to peace and two approaches to getting the peace. Well, first of all, Russell suggests that we can look at peace as being something that is absolutely right, and we can look at it as being something that's relatively right. And by that I mean rather that there are doctrines such as ahimsa that says all violence is wrong. All war is wrong because any kind of violence is wrong. Any reaction to the world that causes harm to persons, property, living things of any kind, this is wrong. Period. Now that's hard to defend. Most people are going to want to argue in favor of things at least like self-defense, defense of family, that when your country's attacked, fighting back in a war is okay. So that's what he means by then relative pacifism, that very few occasions are occasion when violence is permitted. Again, we think of our era as a violent era. Research history going backward. You'll find that things were much more violent in the 20th century than so far in the 21st, in the 19th compared to the 20th, the 18th compared to the 19th, so forth, going right back on into time. Our lives are far more peaceful than our forebears. So, we have a state of relative pacifism, at least maybe not as pacifistic as Russell would like, but we've had no world wars lately, and certainly no wars that carried out the kind of destruction that the last World War did. So in that regard, he'd say we're moving in the right direction toward at least a relative peace for all. He also distinguishes between what individuals can do and what can be done politically. Our goal, of course, is absolute political pacifism, where all the world is committed to peace. What he thinks we have some hope for, at least, is individual relative pacifism, where we as individuals can at least step up on those occasions where we think violence is wrong, where we think war is wrong. We can step up and go, this is wrong, and do so without fear of repercussion or redress. There's nothing wrong been done here. We've done the right thing, in fact. The idea, of course, being that if enough of us get together and push back against enough wars as individuals, against every war we see to be unjust, that ultimately we'll arrive at this political absolute peace. Immanuel Kant proposed a trip to that absolute peace some 120 years before the League of Nations. Kant proposed an approach to international peace. Kant suggests that no peace treaty should be formulated that somehow has a future war built in. We pass in the treaty rules that will permit us to invade you easier next time or something like that. No, the peace treaty has to always have in mind permanent peace in the future. States must no longer be treated as property. We must remember that going back before the American Revolution, the principal form of government throughout the world was a form of monarchy, where the state was understood to be the property of the monarch. That the king owned the country, and therefore was there to be used as the king saw fit, and the country was seen as an appropriate way to get back at the king. It was his property after all. This is something Kant says we can't have anymore. This kind of objectification of people and their belongings, the relationships that exist between people in a culture, this is not permissible. This is wrong if we're going to have perpetual peace. Standing armies would have to be abolished. This sounds radical to us today. We're used to having an army all the time. But throughout most of the history of the United States, a standing army was forbidden. Armies had to be called up at wartime. Only when some kind of military intervention was necessary was an army to be permitted. Hence, among other things, the never-ending Indian Wars of the 19th century that permitted an army to continue to exist even after the Civil War. Interestingly, of course, there wasn't much of an army after World War I. which led to the Marines going everywhere and doing everything, since after all, the Marines weren't the Army. They were a branch of the Navy, and the Navy was okay to have. Kant is from a landlocked country. The idea of a Navy would hardly occur to him. But I think he'd want to say the same thing, that the Navy is permissible only insofar as it prevents piracy and promotes business. No standing armies permitted. The military shouldn't be a profession. It should be something that people do when they have to. No government should be able to spend money outside its own country. Not saying individuals in the country can't have money going back and forth between countries, but the government itself should only be able to spend money within its own country. After all, you can't talk about the interests of your government, your people, your nation in another country if you don't have any interests there. You talk about the interests of your citizens, but the interest of your citizens isn't good enough reason for war, at least not according to most theories of just war. Only the interest of your whole country. And when war is being conducted, it has to be conducted on the up and up. That is to say, no sabotage of the infrastructure of the country that would lead to the average citizen who's not involved in the war having a worse life. You don't conduct war by assassination, by murder, by internal conspiracy. The war is to be fought, if it must be fought, between two armies, two navies, between people whose job is to fight and die and kill. Not poisoning a prime minister, blowing up a bridge that keeps a city connected to the rest of the country. This kind of underhanded behavior has to be taken away, has to be criminalized. Now, Kant then calls for, we've talked about what he wants to get rid of, he then calls for all nations becoming republics. I mean, the whole premise, according to him, of the monarchy is that the monarch owns the country. Well, the monarch doesn't own the country. He said that above. So naturally then, there's no purpose in having a monarchy. All governments then should be representing the will of the people. They should be republics. International laws and international courts need to be established in order to resolve friction between countries, minimizing the opportunity for war. And all persons from other countries must be treated as though they were guests. The idea of being locked away, restricted in your activities, kept out of normal life of the city, forbidden. And vice versa, of course. You're a guest in somebody's house. You don't go messing with the water supply. You don't go trying to foment troubles between people in the family. You come in and you're a guest. You are welcomed and you are gracious back. This, he thinks, will reduce the friction between countries and again minimize the likelihood of anyone will want to go to war. Now, Jan Narveson suggests all this is just wrong-headed to start with. That the goals pacifism claims to support, protection of the innocent, not destroying all the property, maintaining a sense of equality between nations. He says all of this will fall apart without universal pacifism, and universal pacifism is too much to hope for. Especially if, his argument is the one that we all think of. It's all well and good to say, I'm not going to punch you, so you're free then to punch me. As long as you're the only one who has the gun, you don't have to worry anything about using it on the others. And he says, and people then will use it. This is just a fact. Pacifism is an absolute contradiction to itself. It will lead to more war. It will lead to more violent war. It will lead to more successful war, more oppressive nations. Because if only just people are pacifists, then all people who carry out war are criminals and will behave as such. Hegel, who suggested that war is a necessary evil, did so because otherwise he thought that cultures, countries, would atrophy, that they would lose their energy, would cease to grow, that growth, outward projection of culture, of power, of growth. I mean, that's the word we want to use, growth, growth, growth. That growth keeps a culture alive. You cannot stay alive if you stay put. You will die. So he says, I cannot dissolve cultures into one another. It just won't happen. I mean, you lose both cultures at that rate. So if one culture wants to stay healthy and wants to continue to be active, it has to grow, and in order to grow, it's going to require war. That's an awful lot to think about. And we really need to talk about it. And I say this honestly. When all the people I've just talked about were writing, except Narveson. Narveson's a fairly contemporary writer. And Russell. There were no nuclear weapons. Russell, of course, fought for nuclear disarmament, fought against nuclear proliferation, marched in the streets in his late 80s and 90s to try to keep the nuclear weapon out of our arsenals. But we have it. We can, in fact, destroy civilization in a matter of hours. Should that be an option? Is that something we really think is a good idea? If not, that doesn't mean the end of war. It would mean nuclear disarmament. But should it go further? Should it be the end of war? Should we be seeking to do away with what Clausewitz calls a useful tool of diplomacy? That the fear of war, that the horror of war often brings about peaceful agreements that would not have happened otherwise. So we need to think about it. We need to talk about it. And we need to keep on talking philosophy.